for today, okay? Take it over, Joel. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Just like to say, my name is Joel Ackernack. I've been farming with DM Camp & Sons since 2014. Prior to that, I was out in Wasco working for Polar Farms since about 1998. Chuck and his team asked me to come in and talk to you guys about picking a crop and coming in to explain to you guys what kind of the life cycle of it, the history of it, in terms of the different modes of farming in it. I mean, I see some familiar faces in here that have been in the industry a long time, and then others that haven't. And one of the things that in my relationship with Chuck that you know I've communicated to him, and he knows very well too, is that an educated sales force from a farming perspective is a very important tool. You know, a lot back when I started in 1998, the typical salesman of a piece of farm equipment had been somebody who grew up on a farm and wouldn't work for the machine store, so they already had a very intricate knowledge of the equipment. They've used it, they've driven it, they've seen it work, things have been bad. You know, the sales force has changed in the last 20 years, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just that when a salesperson comes out to DM Camp to come and meet with me about selling us a piece of equipment, you know, something that we've been using a long time, it's just important that you guys have the knowledge and understanding of the life cycle of the crop that you're dealing with, to know the right timing for things. And that was one of the things that Chuck asked me to talk about, is just understanding the 12-month cycle, understanding the orchard propagation, varietal selections, all these things to make you guys more educated in when you come out and deal with the customers. Obviously, I'm kind of a captive audience when it comes to being a customer. They have a choice to go buy things from other companies, so I just want to make sure that when you guys are out there with the, you know, because we're all a team, and I look at DM Camp and Kern Machinery, you know, we work together on a lot of things to help you guys help us, and we help you, so we can all be successful together. So basically, the first thing that I wanted to get into was more of orchard propagation. You guys all know the equipment that you guys sell and those sorts of things, but you know, when we look at a piece of property, you're looking at soil type, you're looking at irrigation sources, you're looking at you know, groundwater, surface water supplies, you're looking at irrigation types, fan jet, flood, drip irrigation. You know, 20 years ago when I started, basically everything was all flood irrigated. Obviously, water was cheaper, it was more readily available. Times have changed for us to become more efficient in irrigation methods. So when you look at a piece of property, you're looking at what sort of, you want a well-drained soil, you want low salts. You know, almonds are not very tolerant to salts. They're not very tolerant to salty water either. You know, we've seen a lot of trees on the west side of I-5 start to come out as the water has become more expensive, and the saltier aqueduct water is having an impact on almonds. Now, pistachios, on the other hand, are much more salt tolerant. You see those remaining on those areas, but typically the almond production development has moved east as time has gone on and water's become more expensive to pump uphill. Closer to the Sierras, you have better well-drained soils. So that's one of the things that we look at. So as we look at a piece of property, you know, right now DM Camp is putting in reservoir irrigation systems to plant trees in the fall. 20 years ago, all the trees were bare root. You get them from a nursery that come in January, there'd be a stick with a bunch of roots on the bottom, just basically bare, wrapped up in 20 or so trees in a bundle. You go out and you dig a hole and you put this bare root piece of stick in the ground in January, and it would bloom out and grow from there. But what's happened in the last 15 or so years is the development of the potted tree. The nurseries have developed methods of planting trees and budding them into pots so that we can plant them basically any time of the year. We prefer DM Camp, and just things that I've learned over the time, is planting them in around September, October, after the main heat of the summer, before the winter time, so that that tree has a chance to establish. You take it out of the pot, put it in the hole, it has a chance to establish some roots, you know, outside of that potted area, so that when you're blooming out in the early spring, the root already has some development. Where the bare root tree, the way it used to be, is you plant it and it would take a while for those roots to get reestablished. So it would be slower propagation. Basically, what we've said is that roughly you pick up about a half a year by planting them in the fall. So by the time your first crop comes around, you plant your tree in October, you have your first leaf out the following February. It takes till that third leaf out till you get your first crop. So by that third year, you're about a half a year ahead, so typically your third year crop is a little bit more than it would have been with the old barren construction. Fourth year, you're getting into that where you're making enough yield to equate for your growing costs, and then by the fifth year, you're in full production. And typically about 5 to 15 years is your money train. That's where the bulk of your production comes in. After the 15th year, somewhere in that neighborhood, yield starts to decline, trees get hardened off, the wood gets, it's a little bit harder to put buds on, you have other disease issues and whatnot. And then trees can last somewhere between 20 to 25 years, and there's a lot of factors involved in when to pull an orchard out. Primary factor to pull an orchard out is what the price of almonds are. So you look at it in 2020, the price of almonds is going to be about $1.60. So there's going to be a lot of old orchards that are making in that 2,000 pound or less range that guys are going to say, hey, this isn't making any money, we'll push it out, plant something behind it, either come back to almonds or do something else with it. But typically that's the lifespan of the almond is about 25 is about the max. There are some that go longer, and that's that it just depends some on how you maintain them over the years. Other issues, water issues, disease issues, like I said. So varietal selection, there's been commercially non-Perel is the industry standard. That makes up roughly, rough numbers is about 50% of the crop. It's the nicest, it's the supposed best flavor, best shape, best color, all those things. It's been the industry standard forever. But the almonds have to be cross-pollinated. So if non-Perel is the nut you want, you have to cross-pollinate with something else. There's probably about 7 or 8 really mainstream varieties that are utilized by the industry. There's the non-Perel, and then there's the California varieties, which involve like Carmel, Monterey, Fritz. There's some Butte Padre mixed in there. Those are the hard shells. There's some Missions, which are like a really smaller hard shell variety. There's other smaller ones that aren't really utilized, but some guys grow Wood Colony, Price, Sonora. But typically that you narrow it down to non-Perel, Monterey, Fritz, Butte Padre. Those are about the 5 that I would say make up probably 80% or more of the industry. A lot of the plantings in the last 10 years have gone to this non-Perel Monterey 50-50. Monterey is a later harvesting variety, but the big thing about pollination choices and variety selection is pollen overlap. If you select varieties that don't bloom at the same time, your bees are out and they're got a lot of flowers on one variety and there's nothing open on another variety, you're really going to suffer in pollination. So the key is picking pollination times that match closely. Non-Perel and Monterey are ones that really match up well, as do the Butte Padre, so that's another good 2 variety selection. There are some new, not new, but the problem with variety selection is it takes a long time to figure out what a good variety is, and then you have to propagate it, you have to plant it, you have to see what happens. So there's been some self-pollinating varieties that have come out commercially in the last 5 or 6 years. Independence is one that's marketed by David Wilson Nursery. Another one is Shasta that's marketed by Virtual Nursery. Those in theory are varieties that don't technically need bees. They've done studies where they put nets over them and they still make nuts. One of the things that I've experienced or seen with the Independence, it's an earlier harvesting variety, but one of the issues it has is it has a lot of nuts that are in on the main scaffold, which make them harder to shape. One of the things obviously in variety selection is yield and ease to farm and then ability to harvest. And if it's a difficult one to harvest, we may shy away from that. Our intention in our production was going to be to plant some Independence in the mix. We've backed it off and we're going to plant a little bit more of the Butte Padre, which is a good yielding variety selection. The hard shells have a little bit less insect pressure. The non-Perels and the Montereys are called soft shell. Typically, and we'll get into the chronology of it in the calendar, but about in July, that soft shell starts to open up It allows for an insect to come in and embed itself in the shell and work its way into the nut, causing damage that costs us at harvest with quality issues. Where the bupodry combination is more of a harder shell, that worm can't get in it, so we typically don't do as many sprays in that. We're more often going to be just dealing with other disease issues rather than the insect issues. Irrigation type, you know, there's, like I said, 25 years ago, a lot of things were flood irrigated, but there was a much more healthier supply of surface water. You know, there weren't nearly the regulatory issues that we've seen in the California aqueduct with state water, or in the San Joaquin River system for the Bryant, and even in the Kern River Basin with Lake Isabella with the dam issues that have been hindering the storage capacity in Lake Isabella for about the last 14 years. They're actually in the process of finishing rebuilding the dam up there to allow, basically Lake Isabella has about 500,000 acre-foot storage. In the last 15 years, they've reduced that storage to about 325,000 acre-feet because of some seepage issues that were encountered 15 years ago. They've studied it to death, they've studied it to death, they've studied it to death, and they're finally actually doing, over the last 4 years, they're doing some construction. Hopefully by 2022, they'll be able to go back to that max capacity. So what happens with water storage is, you know, the snow melts in the Sierras, it goes down into these reservoirs, and then it's supposed to be held there until the irrigation demands from the contract holders that built the dams back in the 50s and 60s are able to use that. And with all these restrictions that have been put on both by these, you know, dam issues and then also other environmental regulatory issues, we've lost a lot of access to surface water. So we've had to rely more on groundwater pumping, which then precipitated SGMA in 2014 that has caused, you know, basically the state to come in and mandate that we're going to have to watch out for groundwater overdraft, subsidence issues, and all these things, which has had a big impact on Central California. And it will continue to do, because in 2020 we were required to submit the basin, Kern River Basin was required, and statewide, Kern River has its own basin, to submit plans for how we're going to mitigate these issues. And so what's going to potentially happen over time is that the amount of farmable ground in this area is going to reduce. So what we're looking at is, and for our own operation, is to maximize profit in permanent crops, which is, you know, obviously that's the bottom line, is for us to make money, but also to be conscious of, if we're planting a permanent crop and restrictions come in where we can't pump like we had once had been pumping prior because the groundwater levels are going down, the state or even on the local level may come in and restrict our pumping ability. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that when we're planting these things, we have ability to secure water long term. So one of the things that we're doing on one of our locations is we're going to be putting in subsurface recharge. And some of you guys that have been dealing with companies like Wonderful and Westchester, and a little bit down in Kern Delta with Jeff Fabry, I believe, put in some of these systems where you take water. In 2017 was a great water year. There was excess water in Kern River, it ran all year long. But what happens in years like that is we take water off the river and we recharge the groundwater to help bring groundwater levels back up. So what we can do with these systems is we can bury them underneath the almond orchard before it's planted, and then when there's high flow water, basically high flow water is when there's more water than anyone can use, we bring those in and we basically put it in underneath the trees and we recharge the groundwater. And what that does, it builds its pumping credits. So that in a 2017 year, if we bring in an amount of water, we put it under our orchard, and we put it, basically putting it in the bank, we can take it out at a later date. So what that's doing is that's protecting our irrigation for long term, in terms of being able to secure planting a crop that we know is going to be there for 20 years, or 25 years, but having that stability knowing we're still going to be able to farm it 25 years from now because we have the water supply. And that's going to be a big thing moving forward. You know, you see a lot of areas that have no surface supply where they're only being pumped by a well. Or you have other areas that have well water that isn't very good in terms of growing trees. That's really going to limit where people are going to go out and plant trees moving forward. And SGMA is just going to make it more difficult for all of us to exist in the state. My personal side note is, though, I do agree with it to some extent. There's been places that investment groups have come in and planted trees in areas that were either unfarmed before taken desert ground out, planted pistachios on it, drilled wells in the ground, and started pumping water down. That has an overall without any surface supply. Basically, surface supply is the only thing that's recharging the groundwater. The more you pump out, the more the groundwater goes down. So if we have dry years and there's more straws in the ground, that groundwater goes down faster. So I do believe that Sigma has its place. The way the state did it, I really wasn't a big fan of, but that's neither here nor there at this point, because we are where we are. 2020 basically was the starting line of Sigma. It took us 6 years to get our plans in place, and basically from now moving forward every 5 years through 2040, we're supposed to be making sure that we're maintaining that groundwater balance. But what they're not saying is that you can take it down, but you can't keep taking it down. You can take it down and bring it back up. So essentially, we're trying to manage the groundwater. So after 25 years, once these trees have lived out their life, and either the price has gone down, or you've had too many die from disease issues or blowovers or whatever, basically that's the end of your life cycle to start over. So there's been some interesting developments in the last couple of years. Previously, we used to just push all the trees in a big pile and burn. Well, the Air District doesn't like that. The Air District doesn't like us burning anything anymore, including tumbleweeds. So one of the new developments so then they went into, you push an orchard out, you grind up the trees into chips, and you haul them to the cogen plant up in Galena. Well, that no longer exists. So basically then these great methods of us taking these chips out of the orchards and utilizing them in other methods have been restricted too. So one of the things that's developed in the last couple of years is basically taking that orchard, chewing it up into chips, and then respreading it on the ground. I've seen a few guys around here. There was a big orchard at the corner of 7th Standard and Zerker. It was taken out last year. They ground all those trees up, spread them back on the ground, just under. It's going to be interesting to see, and then they've replanted trees on it since. It's going to be interesting to see how that develops. Because one of the questions that I have, and we don't really know, is if a tree has a disease in it, and you grind it up and put it back in the soil, is that disease still there? But it's one of those things that we're not sure, and we're really not going to know until we get further down the road with these replanted orchards. But basically, orchard comes out, you can decide what you're going to do with it. You're either going to go and plant a different crop in it, or you're going to do something to either fumigate the soil, get rid of any root-borne diseases, and those sorts of things, and go back to replant almonds. The other thing we've seen a lot of in the last few years, a lot of grapes come out, going into almonds. We've seen a lot of citrus come out, row crops going out. Basically, bottom line, in our view, and most of the view of other farmers around here, is almonds is where the money's at. One of the differences in, if you look at, there's a lot of people that would say pistachios the same way, but the difference between almonds and pistachios is the return on your money. Pistachios is a 7-year to your first crop, where almonds is a 3. So if you have time to wait to get your money, pistachios are a good place to be. But if you're in a little bit hurry to turn over cash, get back into the profitability quicker, because planting is, you have an irrigation system of $2,000–3,000 an acre. You have a tree cost. You have a land development cost, land prep. You have all of the first 3 years of growing before you have any money returns. So basically, we're out here spending money for the first 3 years before we see a penny in return. So that's the thing of we're waiting for that year 5 to 15 before we're starting to make the money. But essentially, we're making a long-term investment. You're buying a stock in something, and you're hoping it returns in 3 to 5 years. You're putting your money in your 401k, hoping that down the road it's going to pay off. We're doing the same thing. Whereas we grow a parent crop, we plant it, and 6 months later we know what we have. We either made money, we didn't, we go on to the next one. So these permanent crops are more of a long-term investment. But almonds, the way they've been, the beauty of almonds is it's relatively a niche crop for California. Kern County by far is the best producing county in the state. Tulare County, Fresno County, the further you move north, the yields seem to decline for various reasons, weather related, chilling hours related. But Kern County by and large is the highest producing county on a per acre basis in the state. So this is kind of the thing we're going to. So what they wanted me, now that I kind of gave you the background on how more or less almonds go from start to finish, the main thing they wanted me to talk about is for your guys' needs in terms of on a month-by-month basis. So if you guys know what's going on our orchard when you come out to visit us, you already have in your mind what operations we're doing, what things we're looking at, what kind of equipment we might need for those sorts of operations. So you know, it's hard to figure out what the best timing of where to start and finish, because it's a 12-month ongoing cycle of things. But you know, obviously, if we're just going to pick a calendar year, okay, let's say we're going to start in the month of January, when nothing, essentially in January, nothing is going on for the most part. What happened to my?
I don't know, it's right here.
So
It's there to start.
oh yeah. So basically, you know, if you start in January, we're accumulating chilling hours, because an almond tree, being a deciduous tree, it drops its leaves, it needs chilling hours to regenerate carbohydrates to produce the crop for the next year. It's basically taking a nap. It's hibernating like a bear. Typically in the month of January, we're just finishing up a little bit of the winter work. We put on a Dormant Spray, which is typically for, there's some disease issues we're trying to prevent long term in the coming out. It's an oil and sometimes a Varietal Spray for some of the overwintering insects that are in the orchard. But there's not a lot going on in January. It's about the slowest time of the year you can have for an almond tree. But obviously what we're doing is we're just setting ourselves up for bloom. Bloom starts, you know, my number in my head always is the 10th of February. I always say the 10th of February bloom starts, the 10th of August harvest starts. That's just, you know, obviously that's plus or minus. Bloom is the time we make our money, essentially, because, so we're bringing bees in for pollination in late January. You want them in place before any bloom starts so they're there and active and ready to go. You're hoping that your varieties are coming out. We have some orchards that are 4 variety orchards. We have some that are 2 variety orchards, but you know, you want that pollen overlap. You want the flowers open at the same time, so the bees are out there. We're spraying typically. Some of the pink bud spray is 10% open bloom. You're going out there and protecting against spraying some fertility to help make sure you're maximizing pollination opportunities. Putting on fungicides for botrytis. Typically, we're not spraying any insecticides during this time. We're also trying to spray at night to make sure that we're not doing any damage to the bees. So we've actually started trying to reduce the number of sprays during active bloom. As I'm sure you guys have heard or seen, the bees are a live organism. We're renting them for, you know, $300 to $500 an acre to come out and pollinate our crop for us. They're an absolutely vital industry that we need. So we're doing what we can to protect the bees. Spraying, you know, we used to spray during the day, spraying by the bee boxes, and there's all these materials on them. Well, anymore, you know, and whether it does good or bad, we don't know, but we're trying to protect our beekeepers. It's an expensive investment. We want to make sure that every bee is out there doing its work, because if they're not doing the work, we're not getting any crop developed. So we're essentially just, you know, doing a bloom spray. There's a petal fall, or they're later in the bloom. Sometimes, depending on the time, you might do a second bloom spray if it's wet and rainy. If it's dry, there's not a lot of fungicides that are needed. You know, there's not a lot of inoculum out. If there's no rain, like this year, it was perfect for the month of February. We didn't even do a pink bud spray because there was no need. You know, typically, if it's cool and it's rainy, that's when the funguses are more active. So we're trying to avoid any sprays if we can during bloom, but obviously if the conditions warrant, we're out there. So, you know, we're doing air blast sprays. We're out there, obviously, as it starts to get warmer, the weeds start to grow, we're mowing middles, that sorts of things. But basically just letting the bees do their work, because once the crop is set by the bees, you know, we're done. Basically, our money is made in these 2 weeks and 3 weeks in February when these flowers are ready. So we need good weather. You know, basically bees fly between 55 degrees and above. They don't. You know, bees are really finicky. They're really particular. They're kind of, I can't say that. I don't want to say that. They're kind of like my wife. They're very particular.
Loving.
They're very generous and loving. But no, they don't like it when it's rainy. They don't like it when it's windy. They don't like it when it's cold. So it has to be good weather for them to be out. It's one of the things that we really are concerned about is these flowers are open and it's 47 degrees and raining. And you drive by those bee boxes and there's like 1 or 2 coming out. You know, that's when you start to get that up. You know, what's going to happen. Well, this year we had 80-degree weather. It was still and calm. The bees were were exploding out of those boxes as soon as the sun got on them, and they're working all day long. That's what we'd like to see. But one of the problems that comes with that too is the blooms move really fast too, because the blooms kind of the temperature. If the trees are warm, it's like, oh, it's time to go. Those things open up, and there's only a certain amount of time that pollen is viable on each one of these flowers. And the warmer it is, the shorter that time is. So it's the combination of viable bloom and bee flight time, which essentially sets our crop. There's other factors with fertility and whatnot, but the bottom line is, for those 2 weeks in February when those flowers are open, that's what does it for us. So once that period is done, we're moving on into petal fall. So the trees are leafing out, the petals are falling off, your little nutlets are starting. One of the things that moving into March that we see is this is the time we cannot have cold weather. That's the big thing about if you're getting down into the 29, 28 degree range, anytime once that bloom has been fertilized and that little nutlet is starting, if you go out, post bloom, you see the stamen tip, and back behind it there's just a little nutlet forming. And we had this 2 years ago in 2018 spring. We had some really cool weather on our third leaf trees up off by Middle Field. And you could go out there right after that cold weather, and inside that nutlet was just turned black. And we lost quite a bit of our crop. So this is a critical temperature time for the propagation of the crop. But other than that, we're doing a petal fall spray. You're spraying the weeds on everything's starting to grow. You're spraying the borders to keep them clean for harvest. And basically, our herbicide program is designed to keep the borders clean for harvest. That's really the only reason why we're doing that. And if your boss likes to see things clean when they dry by. But that petal fall spray you're putting on some fertility. That last fungicide treatment for shot hole, a little bit of brown rot spray, those sorts of things, and protecting against the foliar diseases, not so much on the nut itself, but on the tree and the leaves that are coming out. You're adding nutrients in to help start making that crop. So March, you're done with the bulk of the crop production, and now you're just in maintenance. And then the same thing, you're moving through April. As those trees leaf out, starts to dry out, you get dust around, spider mites like to come in. One of the things, if you drive around right now and you start to see those trees with webbing on them, which I'm sure some of you guys see as you're driving around, hopefully not any of my trees, but that's the spider mite. And that really doesn't do any crop damage. It doesn't hurt the nuts at all, but what it does is it affects the tree's ability to take up nutrients. You have that dirt and a basal layer on the trees that doesn't allow for it to really pull in all the nutrients and stuff for photosynthesis, so the tree suffers. And ultimately, there are times when you get enough of the mite damages, you'll see some defoliation around harvest. Really, it doesn't affect this crop at all. What it's doing is it's really affecting next year's crop, because your bud formation happens in the fall. If it loses its leaves in August, that tree is just burning up in this heat. So, because the leaf essentially is a protective mechanism for the tree itself. So, you're doing your herbicide work, you're doing your mowing, basically keeping your middles clean, and you're taking care of any pests. The major pest that comes in April is the mite spray. You're using your air blast sprayers to go through. Typically potentially some foliar diseases. Rust and alternaria like to start, late April, early May. As it starts to get warm, you get a little more humidity. So, it's just maintenance now. You're irrigating regularly. In April, you're fully leafed out. You can see nutlets that are starting to size, and you're just doing your maintenance on your tree. As you move into May, it's sort of the same thing. May there's more insects that are coming in. Stink bug, leaf-footed plant bug, or two that have really come on in the last 5 years or so. 10 years ago, this wasn't even around. Mite has been an issue as long as I've been growing almonds, but leaf-footed plant bug really has only come around in the last 5 to 7 years, I would say. It has a really quick ability to damage a crop. What it does is it comes in and it flies in on the nut and it stings it. It has basically like a beak on it, goes in and sucks some juice out of the nut. Because the inside, if you look at a nut in May, it's soft, it's white, it's gelatinous. it goes and pulls those nutrients out, and then that nut either dies or drops off or has a big black mark on it. Or the shell, or the hull, excuse me, not the nut. You can't see the nut right now. But leaf-footed plant bug, stink bug, those are two in the last decade or so that have really become a problem. They're really prevalent in the late spring, early summer months. So you're doing the same sort of thing. And one of the problems with the dynamic between these two is you spray for this and you're killing the predators for this. So one of the things we're always trying to do is you hear about integrated pest management, but the dynamic between beneficial insects and the insects you don't like is really critical. And that's why having a good PCA who understands that, isn't just a spray kind of guy, is critical for, you can accept a little bit of damage from this because this could really affect you long term. Or you can accept a little damage from this because this has gotten so bad it's going to affect this year's production. This is a this year production problem, this is a next year production problem. So you're trying to deal with the balance between, there's a predatory thrip that takes care of these. If that population is building up, you don't worry about the mite, you spray that. So, we're trying to balance the beneficials and the damaging insects. One of those things that you never know what you're doing is the right call. A lot of this is feel and experience. I mean, I like Chuck said earlier, he's always learning. I'm learning every year. And every year you're making decisions different than what you might have done last year, or the same as you might have done 10 years ago, or whatever. And everything that I've done over the past 23 years of growing crops has been a learning experience, and you put that in your memory bank, and you never know where you're going to use it again. But you make the best decision you can based on the information you have right at the moment, and hope it's the right one. And that's one of the things in our industry is we have to be decisive. That's the bottom line. We have to make a decision. And unfortunately, outside of our industry, there's a lot of people that are afraid to make decisions because they're afraid of being responsible or the repercussions of a mistake or whatever. And I've just learned in my time if I make 90% of the decisions right, I'm going to be okay because I can't make them all right. And then if I don't, hey, don't do it again. If we sprayed too early and blew up the mite, okay, we shouldn't have done that. We won't do that next time. Or we let the mite get too far or something else happen, because everything is a dynamic, and that's what we're doing. It's a balance between pest, disease, irrigation, fertility, all these things we're trying to manage and mitigate and learn. And every area is different. We farm south of Arvin, where we have different bug and disease pressures that we have up by the field. And so you can't just throw a blanket over everything for every grower and say how it's going to work. Because one of the things too about, if you guys go out, I didn't really talk about tree spacing and like trees per acre, but when we choose orchards, our personal choice on row width and tree separation is 22 by 18, which is 110 trees per acre. Well, there's all kinds of different ways to do this. There's all kinds of different ways to approach herbicides. There's all kinds of ways to approach mowing and whatnot. But in terms of our personal orchard propagation, 22 by 18, 110 trees per acre. Where I was at before, we were 20 by 24 and a half, which is the true diamond pattern, and that's 94 trees per acre. So, basically from the nursery, they have cheat sheets of, if you're 24 by 20, here's how many trees per acre. And what's happened in the last 10 years or so, plantings is plantings 20 years ago used to be all about maximizing spatial arrangement. So the trees will all have their own areas to fill in light and whatnot. And we've gotten to where we see better yields by planting them tighter together. Well, part of the problem with that is then you're closing off airflow and you're increasing disease pressure. So there's always a balance of what your personal choice is. But I have a friend who owns a trucking company who now planted almonds. Of course, I get impelled that his trucking rates are too high because he went out and bought farm ground and became a farmer. But he's like, man, Joel, everybody's telling me what to do. And I said, look, there's a million different ways to do it. I mean, there is not a specific right way to do it, nor is really there a specific wrong way to do it. But you pick out what's best for you, and that's what you decide to stick with and be consistent. And if it doesn't work, do something else. But, you know, I have my own pruning methods. I have my own spray dynamics that I like, but the guy across the street may not agree. But we're both growing almonds. We're both making roughly the same yields. Hopefully my yields are better than his, and my trees look better than his. But ultimately, we're in our own little world trying to get to the finish line. So it's the same sort of thing with the spray dynamics. You know, April, May, into June. That's all you're really doing. You're doing some fertility with our irrigation systems. We have some crops that are on drip. We have some that are on micro sprinklers. About half. Some of our older plantings are on micro sprinklers. All the stuff we're doing now is on double on drip. The beauty of that is all through the season we're just putting on fertility through the irrigation system. We're adding soil amendments through the irrigation system. We're adding water treatments through the irrigation system. It really makes farming in terms of adding nutrients and fertilizers pretty simple the way these irrigations are set up. June, the nuts are starting to fill. You're starting to get, you know, if you cut them open, you see that you can see the nut itself. It's usually pretty white. Looks like it just looks like a piece of white jello. It's really soft. It's gelatinous. Even the hull itself is still pretty white, soft. The outer shell is, or the outer hull is still really green. That's actually a really good picture of it. So, you know, just a softer nut inside. The shell hasn't hardened off. It's just filling. You're growing. You're still dealing with the same problems of the Mite, leaf plant bug, stink bug, alternaria, rust, Vulturespiria. There's just some, you know, we have a lot of pressure from a lot of different disease and bug issues. So as I was speaking before, once we get into July, that's the whole split. So there's soft shell nuts, the nonpareils, the caramels, sonoras, the prize, wood colony, all of those soft shell varieties. That hull starts to kind of brown up a little bit. Splits down the suture, that thing opens up, and what that does, it opens up an opportunity for native orange worm. That's typically, historically, been one of our biggest insect pressures on that quality. Obviously, leaf and plant bug and stink bug have added into that mix, but native orange worm is one of those ones that you hear hull split spray. It's time for hull split spray. Well, that's when we're out there trying to protect against those native orange worm flights. There's great information that they follow on degree days, which is the number of degrees of temperature it takes between flights of native orange worm. They have it dialed in pretty well, so we know that on July 4th or July 7th, there's going to be a flight of native orange worm, so we're going to try to basically time our sprays around to take care of those infestations. Native orange worm gets embedded into that nut. You open it up, it's got a bunch of webbing in there. You know, there's a hole in the nut. That thing's garbage. You're not going to get paid for that. So that's the critical time, starting roughly. I think 4th of July is always the date in my mind that I think of the hull split sprays. This year was a little bit earlier for whatever reason. You know, I don't ever try to figure out why things timing-wise happen the way they do, because there's absolutely no consistency year over year. In terms of exact timing, I just have specific general dates in my head and can work around them. Native orange worm spray. Typically, July also is the time you're starting to get your middles set up for harvest. If you have, you know, orchards that have typically all year long, you're keeping your border areas clean. Some guys like to spray herbicide all year round, keep the whole thing completely sanitary year over year. That's not my method. What we like to do is leave every other row with I'll call them weeds, but grasses or other vegetative growth in the middles. The reason I like to do that is my theory is that it harbors habitat for beneficial insects. So that helps, in my mind, with some of the mite issues we've had. So what we'll do is we'll mow one row and leave the other row and let it grow. And then we'll come back a few weeks later and mow that row that we didn't mow and let the other one grow. But as we get into July, you know, you have orchards that have grass that's 6 inches tall. You want to try to get that taken care of before you get to harvest, because obviously when you get into harvest, that's, you know, you don't want any debris, as little debris in the windrow as possible. So July is the time that we typically start doing all burn down sprays on the whole border, basically from border to border, all the middles, trying to get everything burned down. So it's dead, you come in and mow it right before harvest and everything's clean. Obviously, as you guys probably can see, you know, go out this morning and there's dust everywhere. This is obviously when August is when harvest starts. This year we actually, I will say August 10th. This year we actually started shaking on July 26th, which to me is very early, but for whatever reason, last few years, I had a couple orchards that seemed to be earlier than everything else. So, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we do 1-hole split spray. This year we're doing 3. We've gotten into where we're doing 3-hole split sprays on these non-pro varieties every single year. Because we farm in some areas down in Arvin that's around Greenway's organic operations. We have significant pest pressure from, I'm blaming them, whether it's them or not. We have significant pest pressure down there from stink bug, native orange worm. We have 3, 5, 7% damage, which many of you guys know that's a ridiculously high number of native orange worm damage. So we've just gotten into the habit of doing 3 sprays. As soon as those first non-pearls are open in late June, early July, we're spraying about every 10 to 14 days up until we're getting ready to shake. So that's why I put in here native orange worm spray early in the month. Some of these, non-pearls that are on different root stocks that aren't nearly as early, we might do another one in the first week of August. This year we did 1 block that we knew we had high pressure on. Because your PCAs in theory should have traps out there. They're getting native orange worm counts in June, July, so they're seeing what the population is doing. It doesn't always translate to what your overall damage is going to be. I mean, we've had traps that have had hundreds of native orange worms in them, and then we have 1% damage. So why that happens, we're not really sure. The timing on sprays is critical, those air blasts. And then obviously as you get into your harvest, shaking nuts on the ground. We run 3 co's, S7s. That machine is really improved, and even since our first model, I can't say enough good about that piece of machinery. It just is a solid piece of machinery. Now, granted, shakers have a very limited lifetime. You see guys running around with 10-year-old shakers. I don't know why they do it, because that machine is designed to self-destruct. It doesn't matter how strong of a weld you put on, how thick your metal is. When that thing is vibrating as hard as it does, every 30 seconds or so for 8 to 10 hours a day, it's eventually going to beat itself to death. So that shaker, to me, that is the most important piece of equipment. It's also the piece of equipment that I want the most experienced driver in. Obviously, some of the technologies in the auto shakes have really kind of taken away the need for a really experienced operator, because now it's more of a hit the right spot, hit the button, it does its thing and retracts, and all you got to do is drive it forward and hit the spot. But at the same time, any barking of any tree will result in that tree being dead in 3 years. So if you see that, you see a shaker that goes out there, if it's too green, or if the tree's crooked, or if the guy's not an experienced operator, he heats that thing wrong and it knocks that bark off, I will guarantee you in 3 years that tree will be dead. You can put all the tar on it and whatever you want, it can't take that sort of damage to that bark. So to me, that's a very critical operation. Your sweepers, for you guys in terms of equipment, the one thing you need to be cognizant of is row spacing. So if a guy has a 24-foot orchard versus a 20-foot orchard, you might need to be selling them a different size head. The burn brush, they've all kind of standardized, so everybody has a burn brush, where that didn't used to be the case. I don't know where Flory's at with the Super V on being able to fit 20 or 22-foot orchards yet. And that's one of the things when the Super V first came out, where I was at before that, so that was 6 or 7 years ago. We tried it in a 20-foot orchard, and it just wouldn't work. We couldn't get it narrowed up. So, but your single side, pull to the middle, one side sweepers, your different row spacing might vary what size head is on it. Guys have different preferences, obviously, on what manufacturer. I mean, I've run every single one. I've run Flory, I've run Exact, and I've run Cincinnati. We have Flory's now just because, not because I've had good luck with all of them, and I'll say except the Exact, but the Exact, only reason we had a problem with it is our farming methods. We kept us in the engine. That was more us. It was a combination of us and them. But that was one of the very early low dust burn brush side where they have the time bar on the outside. That was one of their early models, and we really helped improve some of the air intake and other issues that we were having. But they're all good pieces of equipment. Conditioning, you have your stick jack from Jackrabbit. That's not really much of a conditioner. It's more of something that just takes the big debris out of the windrow. Exact has their conditioner, which we have, and then I believe Rory has one too. I'm not a big fan of conditioning just from a personal standpoint. I recognize that there's times that it's necessary. If something gets rained on, obviously conditioning to get it spread out, get all the debris out is a big thing. My biggest issue with conditioning is handling nuts more than they need to be handled. You pick a nut up, you put it through all that air, you spread it back out, you're going to knock holes off, you're going to potentially knock nuts out of shells. You get deducted at the huller level for chip scarred and broken. So my personal feeling is I don't like to condition unless I have to. If I have a big debris problem or a big dirt problem, I might run it, or if there's a weather condition that would warrant it. Otherwise, I'm trying to handle those things as few times as possible. Obviously, one of my other things is I have younger orchards. Conditioning becomes a bigger issue as trees get older. As trees get older, there's a lot more dry and dead wood on trees, so when you shake it off, you get a lot more sticks breaking off. You get sticks down in the windrow, it makes picking up a heck of a lot more difficult. Anytime you run a stick through a chain that's going around a sprocket, you're gonna have issues. So broken chains, broken sprockets, belt damage, all these things. So conditioning can help in those times in older orchards. It's one of the reasons why, whereas before we ended up getting the stick jack, because we have older trees with a lot of wood debris in the windrows. That stick jack does a good job of pulling the bigger sticks out, and basically it leaves the windrow in place. It's more like the wood chuck that's on the elevator, but it's driving through the windrow. So instead of taking that stick out of the orchard through the harvester and onto the elevator and pulling it out there, you're pulling it out into the field. So picking up, same thing. You got your exact lease for you. Obviously, as everyone knows, between this, and this, air quality has become a big issue. San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District has got some monies for low dust harvesters. There's no low dust in any of this. I don't care what you say. He's been bugging me about it for like 10 years. What are we going to do for low dust? Honestly, I don't know what to tell you, because there's guys that I've seen at the Almond conference of, oh, we're gonna do this overhead harvester, we're gonna put them all into a catch frame, we're gonna take them out of the field. And part of the problem with that I see is, in order to take all those nuts out of the field, you need a space just as big to set them out. Because if I have a windrow of nuts that's 3 feet wide and a 1/4 mile long, and I got 200 rows of that, I need 200 rows of 3 foot wide, because you can't pile these things up and let them dry out. They have to be spread out. So you're not picking them up until whole moisture is about 7 or 8%, or nut moisture is 7 or 8%, whole moisture is below 13%. And what we do is we take samples of nuts into the huller. They have moisture meters. We actually have one of our own. We do our own sampling, because you can't take these things in wet. And that's one of the things that I was talking about with the conditioning under wet circumstances. You get rain. We got rain this morning in Arvin. Thankfully, I don't have any nuts on the ground right there. But there's other guys that do. So there's guys that may be out there starting to condition nuts this afternoon once it strikes out. But that you got to have them spread out. You got to have them free of debris, because if they're not dry, they won't take them. If they take them in wet and they stockpile them, those things will catch fire. It's happened on quite a few occasions in late falls, where guys take wet nuts into the huller. They don't run them immediately, and they put them in a stockpile. This is, if you look at an almond hull, it's a relative of a peach, so it's like a peach outer coating. If it gets moisture in it, that thing will rot in the heat. So that's the key for us, is we have to take it in dry. There's obviously a balance of not letting it get too dry. My boss says, well, can we play the moisture game to where we get it in with 1 or 2% more moisture, so you're getting more pounds across the scale? And it's like, I'm just trying to get him out of the field. I don't want to try to play that game. Yes, in theory, it'd be awesome if we could get them at like 8 or 9% moisture at the higher end, because then you're getting paid for the water weight. But from a practical standpoint in the field, it's not something we can really do. So August, we're starting around the 1st of August. Nonpareils, Carmels, Wood Colony, Price, Sonoras, those are all early in. Late August, you're looking at Butte Padres starting to come ready. Some of them starting to come ready right now. Monterey is a little bit later, typically first part of September. Fritz is late. It can be late September and into October. Looks like we got a couple videos of shakers and sweepers, harvesters. These are a key function, especially on the side shakes. You're clearing the nuts out of the tire row. I know this is a big wear item for guys during the season. The other thing is obviously the flaps that are on the shaker head. But you know, there's two styles of shakers. There's the mono boom, which is the one that is always driving backwards and going into the trees, and then this side shaker. From an operator standpoint, I'll tell you what, that mono boom takes. It's an art to drive that thing. I will say that I've driven every piece of equipment we have. The mono boom by far is probably one of the most difficult pieces of equipment to operate. Just from a, you're driving with your left foot forwards and backwards, and you're gassing and braking with your right foot, and you're trying to hit this, and then you're working levers. I mean, this, of course, I'm saying this is older shaker technology. Nowadays, those side shakes, driving down the road, hit your spot, that thing goes out, does all the work for you. So, but still, it's a really critical operation. Damage to the tree, you're wanting to make sure that the timing and the pressure is right based on trunk size. You're not shaking it too long that you're wasting time on knocking all the leaves off. You're not shaking too short so that you're leaving nuts on the tree. So I mean, that to me is it's the most critical piece of our operation in terms of harvest is the quality of shade.
This video is too dark, I think, to show, so I'm just gonna see if I can make it brighter, possibly.
Joel, what's the average navel orange percent damage that's acceptable?
Typical pullers like 2% or less. I mean, to me, that's, if I was to target a number, I want to be under 2%. I mean, obviously, ideally, it'd be under 1%, but, the problem too that's happened with that leaf-footed plant bug and stink bug is they've added another category, a brown spot, into the USDA inspection report. It used to be just insect damage. Now they're digging you for brown spot because in June, once the nut is set, and that stink bug or leaf-footed plant bug stings that nut, it leaves a brown mark on it, and that becomes a deduction from our payables. So, we've had, and then there's ant damage, and then there's, they've added all these categories in, but typically it's always historically been tried to be under 2%. We've had stuff that's run 3, 5, 7%, and we've done 3 sprays and put out pheromone cover. So, it's one of those that I've never been able to put my finger on why certain areas have more pressure than others. I used to try to blame the neighbors, and then we got some neighbors in some places that have terrible sanitation, and we have no damage. And then we have places that have good neighbors and have a lot of damage. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, but 2% to me is the number that in my head. If it's over 2%, I'm like, because if you look at say a 2,000 pound crop, at 2%, you're talking 40 pounds.